about to find out about debut. Welcome to Debut, the interview series. I really enjoy this because I get to talk with amazing storytellers about process. I know you might be wondering, what is debut? And I'm wondering why you don't know. Everybody's talking about debut, or they should be talking about debut. It's where we take three amazing storytellers, accomplished storytellers, and they tell a story for the first time ever in public. No one gets to hear it except for the people who are listening at the time. And at the same time, they're accomplished storytellers, so it'll be a good told story. But afterwards, since I'm a practitioner of play, we play with the story's direction for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we talk about the process. I call it a public storytelling playground. And while this is going on, we have people giving comments to the tellers. And I've literally seen a story go off on debut already and being told at a national event and seen the changes. And it's really fun because he gets up there and says it started at debut. So that's what debut's about: process, play. And I would like to. We have three storytellers coming on in April, the last Sunday in April, and I'd like to bring on one right now. I want to tell you about our storyteller. He's from Mogadore, Ohio. I'm also from Ohio, and so he's an Ohio kin with me. He's been telling publicly since the year 2000. His stories include legends, folk and fairy tales, jack tales, ghost stories, and powerful stories for all ages. He has performed for schools, churches, clubs, metro parks, and he's a father of four and grandfather of more, who's always asking for more of the story. That's what I was sent. Now, let me tell you about this teller. That's not on the paper. He listens. He listens deeply to the stories. And I've seen him take a traditional tale and say to himself, how can I really work this story so that it's impressionable? And it indeed is impressionable. He has a magnetism for telling, but at the same time, organizing people within his area and beyond to get involved in the process of story. It is a wonderful honor to bring on storyteller Joe Conrad. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Kevin.
How are
Thanks
you?
for inviting me to debut.
It is great to have you at debut. You were on my list and you're here now, so I'm super excited. Um, let's just start with this. How did you come to storytelling?
That's a long story. um, you're not going to tell my teacher this, but
Okay.
even in grade school, when we had to do book reports, I would get these anthologies of short stories, and I would read one short story, and that would be my book report. I would retell it, and I got away with that all through high school. So I like short stories because you can sit down and you can read them a complete story. And then I got interested in telling when I had kids.
So, Joe, when I was
Um,
in fifth grade, I had to read Old Yeller. I didn't want to. I wanted to read Spider Man. And I read Spider Man more than Old Yeller, and I read 50 pages, and we had to do the book report the next day. And so I got to the point where I had stopped, and I'd just been making it up. After that, I told him he went to the circus, he went to the doctor, that he started a whole farm and a circus traveling. And he looked at me and he said, Kevin, I don't remember that in the story. And I remember saying, I remember saying, perhaps you read a different version. So you and I are kind of fooling our teachers, and lo and behold, I become a teacher, and you tell stories to kids as well as adults. So tell us a little more about your process and story.
um, And when I first started telling publicly, well, let me go back. When I started telling with the kids, it would be reading the books, and I would animate the books, and I would be loud and boisterous, and uh, I would be so loud and boisterous, everybody would leave the room, and then I had the kids to myself, which is kind of what I wanted to begin with, anyhow. Um, and then we got caught without a book one time, and the kid says, "Well, just tell us this story." And so then I started telling stories to the kids, and when I heard there was storytelling publicly that there, I didn't know anything about this revolution of storytelling that was taking place. Yeah, I found someone told me about Jonesboro and that I should go to Jonesboro, that I would like it. I had people who tell me I'd probably be good enough to tell at Jonesboro, but I never had the time and never had the money. Uh, and then storytelling came to Akron. Akron Public Library had their first storytelling concert, and they invited Milbury Birch.
Wow.
And Milbury Birch got up on stage and she was telling stories, and we had conferences where she was helping us to teach us storytelling. And she told stories that I had heard as a kid. The primary one being Giant at the Ford, which is the story of St. Christopher. And it just caught me then. I had the fever. And when I walked away from there, I knew that I had to go out and tell that story.
Excellent.
So that's how I got started. As far as the process, I think when I first started, and I think a lot of people who start off, they kind of memorize the story, and that's probably a matter of confidence. When you're getting up there for the first time, you really want to know. You want to know your story well, so that you can tell it without getting stuck in the middle of it. So I think I did a lot of memorization at the beginning, but as time went on, and you got more comfortable doing it, I didn't have to memorize. I found that there were certain key words, a certain vocabulary used in storytelling that you had to use. And as I've told on and on, even the stories that I had memorized, they're no longer memorized. The stories are still in there, but they're not told verbatim anymore the way they were in the beginning.
So I've seen that, looking at Milbury, she's a craftsperson with words. She's eloquent with words, whether she's using, borrowing with permission Jane Yolen's words or her own craftsman. I've also seen you really work a story. Um, can you tell me about how that process kind of arised, or you can disagree with me and say, "Oh no, Kevin, I just tell from the instant."
I don't know. It's just sometimes it's, everybody says what story, how do you choose a story? And I always like to say, a lot of times, most of the time, the story chooses me. Uh, I have lots of books, and I'll put a bookmark in that and say I'll get back to that. That's a good story, and that's a good story. And uh, but when you read the story, um, and then that ends up being the one you tell next, because that's the one you're really attached to. Um, the story just comes out. It's like I said, it's not the same story, and it's not always the same story when I tell it.
See, Joe, I from talking to you before, um, I believe you never read the story neutrally. You always read with the lens of how can I lift this story so that it's tellable. Would I be wrong on that?
No, and part of that is the dialogue, and using voices, and scaring the kids half to death when they were younger. That's part of storytelling, and that's an important part in um, getting people to listen and to pay attention and stay involved in the story. Another thing that when I first started telling, uh, to me it was about a performance and about how I looked and how I told. Uh, and the more I got into it, it was more about the audience and trying to get the audience involved, and trying to get Joe Conrad out of it. Uh, so I went from being kind of a very stand up solo performer to um, call and response, giving the audience parts to play. Uh, the more the audience is involved, the more I get into it too.
So would you say that you're working all the time to make the work of telling the story more co-creative, where you're and the engagement is like, how do I get them, whether it's from a look or audience or call response? How has that development been for you? I mean, when you first started out, you said, well, we're all working from memorizing, which could be from confidence. And I agree with that. I mean, sometimes we look at that and go, "Oh, I have to tell it. I'm not ready to tell it my way." You know, we don't do the Frank Sinatra until later. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think it's somewhat perception. I think kids have a whole lot easier time going off script,
Yeah.
and telling their story, telling the same story but telling it their way. And so part of that is paying attention to the kids and how the kids tell their stories. So you learn from the kids, even though you're trying to teach them.
So how have you found a difference from learning from adults, or what are those audiences like? Because I know you work with both audiences.
Well, I think men in general are less able to get to do hand motions and get involved in the story that way. They will repeat certain lines and stuff, but those are the things I like to get people involved in, and that's been a real challenge on Zoom,
Oh,
because now we don't have the audience right there in front of us, and so it's a challenge. So one of the things that I'm trying to do in the next story, that I'm going to present first time on debut,
excellent. We'll get to there.
is, is partially uh, talking to the audience and asking them questions that they're not going to be able to answer. Uh, but at least the question is put out there and they think about the question. So that's a new twist in getting an audience involved.
So you're always searching for new ways to involve the audience. And what you said about your job is less on you. I once heard Jay O'Callahan said, "My job is to disappear and let the story unfold." And I think you would concur with that. I think.
I would.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely would.
So, Joe, what's.
Um,
Go ahead. Sorry.
people people don't need to see the storyteller, but they need to see the picture in their mind that the storyteller is able to present to them through words.
And that's one of the things that you first started talking about is how words make the story. And I always say that they should be visual words or even sensory words that we see. We can't do much with is and was unless we say was cold dead or was vibrantly alive or something. So good storytellers should study words. Would you agree?
Yeah. Um, I don't know where else to go with that, but
That's all right, no worries. But then, saying all of that, 70% of all communication is nonverbal, and it's what you said. You said that males maybe are more constricted. Maybe we need to open up more and welcome with our hand and body and ideas of story so that we bring that closeness. Some of the storytellers that that command a presence know I'm Italian, so I use my hands all the time, but know that delicate balance. Um, Sometimes storytellers get rooted into one way of kind of telling. In your journey since 2000 and even when you were a kid, are you still finding new ways of telling?
Well, yeah, you have to, you different stories tend to focus on different things sometimes, and depending on the characters that are in it, you can use dialect. Uh, you can change the volume. You can change the speed of the story. If it's an anxious moment, you speed it up. If it's scary, you might want to slow it down. And the hand gestures and the eye gestures. Some storytellers do all of their emotion with their eyes. I'm having trouble coming up with the name.
Florence?
Jackie Torrance was one. She could tell the story with just her eyes, I believe.
Yeah, they had a whole book. I think it was called Jackie Tales, but I have to look. The whole book is just close-ups on her face and her hands. And I thought, wow, how can you make this inviting? But I talked to the person who like actually created the book, they spent impeccable time to just capture that essence. And it is a beautiful book called Jackie Tales. It's well worth kind of looking through and seeing those snapshot moments. But I mean, that's why when you're reading a book, sometimes, and that's a great art, reading a story to someone, but telling the story, having that full face, having that full body, having that moment of silence or modes. Jackie was like amazing for that. Um, and so we're not trying to be Jackie, but we can learn from Jackie about face and image. Um, let me ask you this: how do you know a story works for Joe Conrad?
You can tell when you're on and when you're hitting the audience because the audience responds, and you can see the heads nod in the audience, and you said something they agree with, or you know, uh, you can just tell. The audience gives you that feedback, and sometimes the audience gives you the clue that you're not, and you need to change something you're doing. So they help shape the story.
So you can tell if it's truly working when you have an audience connected to it. Uh,
Yes.
okay. Um, how do you use? And you've already kind of spoke to this a little bit, but since debut is a fusion of storytelling and play, how are you using play, and how would you like to use it more in your story work?
Um, I don't, not quite sure how to answer that. Um, I, I think I tend to be more strict and rigid. It's playing with it is not as easy for me, but sometimes all it takes is uh, a bit of an idea to completely change the story. Um,
Hey, so based on what you just said previously, you're finding new ways to play with interaction with the audience. You're playing with words and making them memorable and less memorized. I think you use play more than you give yourself credit for because in the conversation itself, you are on a journey of, and please let me know if I'm wrong on this, but from looking at memorizing words to seeing words that make impact. And then you've also said that audience brings it together, and that you've also talked about movement and silence, and you've talked about uh, just what you said the one moment can change the whole thing. I think that's answering to play. Would I be wrong?
no, that would be right. trying to do all of those things uh, certainly helps.
And I think we constantly, as storytellers, shouldn't be rooted in like I think I'm always a student of story. When I meet young storytellers who are just you know starting out, and you can be 80 and start out, you can be 10 and start out, and you can be 60 or 40. I always tell them I still feel like I'm starting out. How do you answer that?
It's always it's always a new beginning with each story. Um, I have a story that I'm preparing for debut that it's an old British folktale, and I hated that story. Uh,
I love it.
and it's in so many different books, and every time I come across it, I don't know why it was like grading on the chalkboard. And all of a sudden, a couple of weeks ago, I looked at it, and it's completely different.
I
So I'm
love it.
excited about telling it, changing it, modernizing it, and adding a little bit more humor to it.
So it's funny that like, oh my gosh. And is it because it's told too often or it's just in too many books?
Uh, I don't know, Kevin. It's just one of those things. Maybe it's in too many books. Maybe I never saw it as believable, and I'm a believer's believer. I believe in Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and the fairies, and I believe in all that. But the situation, I'll give you the name of it. It's not going to give anything away.
Okay.
It's the old woman who lived in a vinegar bottle.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yes, I know the story and it is in many anthologies.
So it just I hated it, and I wouldn't. I refused to read it. I refused to, you know. But I came across it, and something changed. So we're always changing as storytellers, our viewpoint or perspective, or
And I revisited Rapunzel. I think that um, kids in school can have a different hint of history or of a story when they see it differently when a storyteller reinterprets it. So I love that you're picking a story they're like, I hated this, but now I see it differently, and now I want to try it out differently. Joe, if that's not play, I don't know what is.
that's play.
Yes, yes. And
And
giving yourself permission.
maybe that story has been playing with me for a long time.
And sometimes I JJ Renault, who unfortunately passed away, once said to me, and I had trouble with this right away. A story has to die so another can live. And so I'm thinking the way that that story has been told maybe needs to fade out a little for you so that you can find new ways to tell it. At the same time, honor the tradition upon which it's based. Um, a story has to die so others can live. And so I remember the context of the conversation. She's like, I've talked to people who tell me they've been working on a story for 20 years. Um, she said, well, there's so many others to work on because she couldn't get permission. They couldn't get permission. Uh, there's so much of life that we can do. You're going to have to let that one fold out. Otherwise you trap yourself. So, why debut? Why come on debut?
It's another chance to stand up and tell a story.
Exactly.
Uh, you don't pass that up. It's a chance to meet a new audience, have a new audience meet you. Uh, it's a chance to interact with other storytellers, get feedback. It's always good to have positive feedback from other tellers and listeners. And we don't always, when you're at conferences and stuff, you don't always take the time or get the time to get some of the feedback that you really should have, especially on a new story that you're just trying out.
And we have to seek that out. I've been to too many guilds that, like, and they're wonderful. Guilds are wonderful, but sometimes you never have space. They never place space for feedback and working the story and growing the story. They can bring in workshops, but I think as much as you tell stories, you should be practicing stories and talking about stories. And I'm a little different. I think you should play with the story, and get feedback for it long after you feel it's, or before that it's ready. I think you should deliberately seek feedback at times that that stories are intentionally not ready. I travel the country working on stories that are not ready so that you can explore different story directions. And that's one of the reasons that I created Debut, is so that we can talk about play, we can talk about process, we can talk amongst each other. And you know, I've been doing that for a while.
Yeah, another aspect of that, though, Kevin, is let me turn the table and ask you. I tell a lot of serious stories, um, and I have to work. I have to work more often to try to put humor into my stories. But I also feel that at times when you finish a story, that story needs time to breathe,
Sure.
and that story needs time to sink in, and that also is an aspect that's not provided at most storytelling concerts.
Say a little more about that. I agree with you.
Well, it's the story poses a question. Pori's story poses uh, a reflection that you need to think about, and you can't just okay jump in and grab the next story because the next storyteller's ready. Um,
So it
Sometimes
needs
you need that time to let the story sink in.
So, in circles outside of traditional storytelling festivals, there is that time. I've seen people take a full 5, 10 minutes after a story to allow the story to be envisioned, to be felt, to be experienced. Sometimes um, you're right, and a good MC or a good moderator can recognize that that space is valuable time. It's like one of the tellers on debut said, I didn't feel the pressure because we were under play that I had to work, and then the next teller came because I had a range that I could work with. Often, when you're telling on a stage, the courtesy is there's only so much time between the next story. But I agree with you. There's some healing stories that we should circle around. We should think about. Christina Baldwin, I believe, wrote a book called Story Catcher, and she talks a lot about that. And I think that we underserve the power of story when we only see it as a means for performance. It's also a great entrance gateway to reflection. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, and the perfect example of that was there was a storytelling um, that was focused entirely on 9/11, and there were a couple of amusing stories in there and that, but most of them were serious and talked so much about loss and pain and suffering, and the moderator only on one occasion took the time to stop and pause. Um, it was always moving on to the next story. So I agree. Uh, when we're taking over the role of moderator, we need to look for those stories that need that time to breathe.
The other thing is that using play isn't always about humor. Some people have asked me that. Play is another way to be reflective, to capture a space, to hold still a moment by saying, let's hold this moment and let's play it out for a little bit. I mean, obviously, there's dramatic therapy and there's story therapy, and there's things that are not for performance. But I think we need to think of both story and play as part of a healing process as well. And doing something like 9/11, I wouldn't do back to back stories. I would have space to breathe. I actually am a big advocate for breathing. I think everybody should do it. I'm just kidding. But before I tell a story, I actually breathe and hope that the audience breathes with me. And I look at all three sides and I say to myself, will you accept my story after each breathing, as opposed to just rushing to the story? How do you feel about breathing through the story, either before, during, or after?
Well, I think there's a need for it throughout the story. Uh, they call it the reflective pause. Uh, you need to be prepared to tell the story, so that takes focusing at the beginning, and often throughout that pause says more in it than what any of the words could, to try to fill in that little space with other words. Uh, so
Exactly.
the reflection on the story, the pause on the story is so important.
Very important. And we need to recognize, when I teach storytelling, I teach silence before sound with my students because it's that important. Joe, we could talk for a long time, and we've talked for a little while. When is debut?
When is debut? The last Sunday of the month, which I believe is the 25th.
That is correct.
Yeah, this was a test, wasn't it?
There it is. There it is. And I'll put up the flyer. It's 2 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. Joe, it's been so great to talk with you about your process, about how you use play, recognizing ways that we can use silence and healing. There's just so much. Um, and Joe, Conrad, I am giving you the final word.
The final word. Stay tuned for debut. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you are too.